I never planned on falling for her. But the way my best friend's mom looked at me that night changed everything. It started on a quiet evening at my best friend's house. The kind of evening that felt unremarkable at first. The late summer air was heavy, sweet with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the faint hum of cicadas carried through the open windows. We'd been lounging in the living room, half watching a game on TV, half lost in idle conversation, when she walked in. His mom. I'd known her for years, of course. She'd always been warm, polite, the kind of woman who carried herself with an effortless grace that made people stop and pay attention without realizing why. But that night, something shifted. Maybe it was the soft light of the lamps catching the curve of her cheekbone, or the way her hair fell a little loosely around her shoulders. Or maybe it was simply me, noticing her differently for the first time. She asked us if we wanted something to drink, her voice carrying a natural warmth, but when her eyes found mine, they lingered a second too long, just enough to make my stomach tighten. I told myself I imagined it, but when she handed me a glass of iced tea later, her fingers brushed against mine, deliberate or accidental, I couldn't tell. The cool condensation of the glass against my skin was nothing compared to the warmth of that fleeting touch. I remember the details so clearly. The faint scent of her perfume, subtle, not the heavy kind, more like a whisper of jasmine and clean linen. The way she leaned lightly against the counter while talking to us, her posture relaxed yet elegant, as though she carried her own quiet world with her. She laughed at something my friend said, but her eyes kept flicking toward me in the spaces between. Inside, I was unsettled. I shouldn't have been paying attention to her like that. She was older, experienced, someone who belonged to another generation of stories and responsibilities. Yet that only made me more aware of her. The lines of maturity around her eyes, the poise in the way she moved, the way she seemed both confident and a little lonely, as if there were layers no one else noticed. When my friend stepped away to take a phone call, I found myself alone with her in the kitchen. The silence pressed in for a moment, broken only by the tick of the clock and the faint rustle of leaves outside. She smiled at me then, softer, as though testing whether I'd hold her gaze. And I did. For the first time, I didn't look away. Something unspoken stirred between us in that pause. Nothing happened. No words we couldn't take back, no bold move that would cross a line. Just a glance, a breath, the smallest tilt of her head that made my heart beat harder than it should have. That was the moment I knew I would never look at my friend's mom the same way again. Later that night, after the game ended and the house began to quiet, my friend excused himself to shower before heading out with another group of friends. I decided to linger, partly out of habit, partly because something in me didn't want to leave just yet. She was in the kitchen again, tidying up. The low hum of the dishwasher filled the room, and the warm glow of the overhead light softened the edges of everything. Her profile, the curve of her shoulders, even the faint lines of weariness around her eyes. I leaned against the doorway, watching her for a moment before I spoke. "You don't have to do all that," I said, nodding toward the plate she was stacking. She glanced at me, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Old habits. I like the kitchen neat before I go to bed." Her voice carried a steadiness that always struck me, but underneath it tonight, there was something quieter, something vulnerable. I stepped further in, picking up a glass to dry. She gave me a quick, almost surprised look, as though she hadn't expected me to stay and help. We worked side by side for a while in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that felt charged, not empty. My shoulder brushed against hers once as we reached for the same plate, and though the touch was small, it sent a ripple of heat up my arm. She didn't move away. If anything, she slowed her movements, as if letting the closeness linger. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, almost contemplative. "You've grown up so much." The words caught me off guard. I turned to look at her, and her gaze held mine, steady and searching. For a second, I didn't feel like the kid who used to hang around her house with her son. I felt seen, in a way I hadn't before. "You say that like I was a mess before," I teased lightly, trying to ease the tension I suddenly felt. She laughed quietly, shaking her head. "Not a mess. Just younger. Time moves fast, doesn't it?" Her hand lingered on the rim of a glass, fingers tracing absent circles, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. I wanted to ask her what she was really thinking, but instead, I just said, "Yeah," faster than we realize. The silence after that was heavier, pulling us into it. Her eyes dropped to my hands, still drying the last glass, and then slowly lifted back to my face. The air between us felt different, charged with something neither of us named. I set the glass down carefully, almost too carefully, and for a moment, the sound of it touching the counter felt louder than it should. Her breath caught just faintly, and I knew she felt it too. The shift, the awareness. Nothing more was said, but as I left the kitchen that night, I carried the weight of that silence with me. The kind that doesn't fade but deepens, waiting for what comes next. The night stretched later than I expected. My friend had left to meet others, and somehow, I was still there. She hadn't asked me to stay, but she hadn't asked me to leave either. Instead, she offered me another glass of iced tea, and we drifted into the living room where the television hummed softly in the background, forgotten. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive, where every creak of the floorboards, every shift of fabric, seems to carry meaning. She sat at one end of the couch, curling one leg beneath her, while I settled at the other. There was space between us, but not the kind of space that feels distant, more like a thread stretched just far enough to pull us together. We talked about small things at first: work, books, movies we'd both pretended we'd been meaning to watch. Her laugh came easily, but there was a trace of something in her eyes, a tiredness, maybe, or a loneliness she was too graceful to name. I found myself studying her, not just the shape of her smile but the pauses between them, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear as though it gave her hand something to do. At one point, she asked, "Do you ever feel like you're waiting for life to really begin?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't casual. It was the kind of question you ask late at night when the world feels safer, when you trust the silence to keep your secrets. I hesitated, then nodded. All the time. Like I'm standing on the edge of something, but I don't know what it is yet. Her eyes softened at my words, and for a moment, she looked younger, not in age, but in spirit. Vulnerable, open. She pulled the blanket from the arm of the couch and unfolded it slowly, laying it across her lap. Then, almost without thinking, she extended part of it toward me. It was a small gesture, but when I shifted closer to share the blanket, the air shifted too. Our shoulders brushed, and I felt the warmth of her body through the fabric, steady and grounding. My pulse quickened, but neither of us pulled away. She whispered, almost to herself, "Sometimes I forget what it feels like to just be seen." The weight of her words settled between us, and without planning it, I turned slightly toward her. My hand rested on the edge of the blanket, just beside hers. The back of her fingers brushed mine, light as a question. My breath caught, and I glanced at her. She didn't move her hand away. For a long moment, we sat like that, the world narrowing to the quiet sound of our breathing, the faint glow of the lamp, the warmth of her hand grazing mine. No declarations, no bold confessions, just a fragile, unspoken truth beginning to take shape. That night, nothing more happened, but I went home knowing something had shifted forever. The following week, I found myself back at their house. It wasn't unusual. I'd been there countless times before, but this time, I noticed myself paying attention to every detail, every moment when she was near. It was late evening again. My friend had gone upstairs, leaving me in the living room, scrolling idly on my phone. She entered quietly, carrying a folded basket of laundry. Her movements were graceful, unhurried, as though she was comfortable letting the silence of the house guide her. "Don't let me bore you," she said lightly, setting the basket on the couch. "You don't bore me," I answered before I could think better of it. My voice was soft, almost too honest. She paused, glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then she smiled, a small, knowing smile, and sat down beside the basket. She began folding the clothes, her fingers smoothing fabric with practiced ease. I offered to help, and soon we were working together, side by side, our hands brushing now and then as we reached for the same shirt or pair of socks. Each touch was small, accidental, but it stirred something restless inside me. At one point, She paused, holding a sweater in her lap. You remind me so much of your younger self, she said quietly. Always eager, always kind. But now, there's something different about you. Her words pulled me in. I set the shirt I was folding aside and turned slightly toward her. Different how? She didn't answer right away. Her eyes lingered on mine, searching, and then her hand moved almost unconsciously, resting lightly on my forearm. The touch was feather soft, yet it seemed to ignite every nerve under my skin. I didn't move. Neither did she. Her fingers stayed there, warm and steady, and the silence around us grew heavy with unspoken meaning. My heartbeat thundered in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm, to honor the stillness of the moment. Finally, she exhaled, a quiet, shaky breath. Older, I guess. More certain of yourself. Her hand lingered, then began to pull back, but I couldn't let it. Without thinking, I turned my wrist slightly so that my hand caught hers, holding it gently. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact, her hand in mine, soft yet strong, familiar yet completely new. She looked at me then, her eyes wide, not in fear but in something deeper, something that mirrored what I was feeling. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. Our hands remained joined, still and quiet, like a promise neither of us dared to voice yet. When my friend came downstairs moments later, we quickly slipped our hands apart, returning to the task of folding clothes as if nothing had happened. But the electricity lingered, pulsing just beneath the surface. It wasn't just a touch. It was the beginning of something we both knew we couldn't ignore. It was a rainy evening when it happened, the kind of rain that doesn't crash loudly against the windows but lingers, steady and soft, like background music. My friend had stepped out for the night, leaving me there again, caught between comfort and a quiet nervousness that grew each time I found myself alone with her. She was sitting by the window, a mug of tea in her hands, watching the rain streak across the glass. The warm lamplight softened her features, making her look almost unreal, elegant, but touched by something fragile. I hesitated before approaching, unsure if I was intruding on a private moment. But then she glanced up and smiled, and that was all it took. Sit with me, she said softly. I lowered myself onto the armchair beside her. For a while, we just listened to the rain. There was a calmness in it, but also a tension, the kind that comes when words hover unspoken between two people. You know, she began after a long pause, there are nights I feel like the walls of this house are too quiet. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes carried a heaviness that struck me. I wanted to reach for her hand, but I kept still, letting her finish. I raised a son here. I built a life here. But sometimes, when it's just me, she trailed off, her gaze drifting back to the window. It's easy to forget what it feels like to be wanted. The last word slipped out almost reluctantly, and I felt it settle between us like something dangerous and true. My chest tightened, my breath catching in a way I hoped she couldn't hear. I leaned forward slightly, my voice low. You deserve to feel that. More than anyone. Her eyes snapped back to mine, startled by the honesty in my tone. For a long moment, neither of us looked away. The rain kept falling, but inside the room, the silence was alive, pulsing. Her lips parted, as if she were about to speak. Maybe to dismiss my words, maybe to acknowledge them. But instead she exhaled, a faint, trembling sigh. She looked down at her mug, fingers tightening around it. I shouldn't say things like that, she whispered. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to move closer. And I shouldn't think things like I do. But I can't help it. The confession slipped out, softer than the rain, but real. Her head lifted slightly, her eyes finding mine again. There was a flicker there. Fear, yes, but also something undeniable, something that mirrored the storm inside me. For a second, I thought she might close the distance between us. Instead, she reached out and let her fingertips graze my hand. The lightest touch, but enough to send a shiver racing through me. Then she pulled back, setting her mug down with deliberate care. We can't, she murmured. But her voice betrayed her, trembling at the edges. And in that moment, I knew. The line between us had already blurred, and neither of us could pretend it hadn't. The next time I saw her, the air between us was different. Heavier. as if the unspoken words from that rainy night had followed us, waiting to be answered. I found her in the backyard, just as the sun was setting. She was sitting on the wooden steps of the porch, her arms wrapped loosely around herself, staring at the horizon where the light melted into shades of gold and violet. I hesitated in the doorway, but something about her posture, the quiet curve of her shoulders, the loneliness she carried so gracefully, pulled me forward. When I sat down beside her, she didn't look at me right away. Her voice was quiet, almost carried away by the evening air. "You shouldn't be here so much," she said. "People will notice." Her words stung more than I expected. I turned toward her, searching her profile in the fading light. "Do you want me to stop coming?" Finally, her eyes flicked to mine, and for the first time, I saw the conflict laid bare, longing and restraint tangled together. She shook her head faintly. "That's the problem. I don't want you to stop." The honesty in her voice was fragile, trembling, but it cracked something open inside me. I reached for her hand slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When my fingers brushed hers, she let them stay, her hand warm but unsteady in mine. She closed her eyes, breathing in deeply, as if gathering courage. "This isn't fair to you," she whispered. "You deserve someone who doesn't come with all this complication." I squeezed her hand gently, anchoring her. "I don't care about complications. I care about you." Her breath caught, sharp and shaky, and then she finally turned fully toward me. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. No masks, no barriers, just the raw truth of what we both felt but had been afraid to admit. And then it happened. She leaned forward, slowly, as if testing the air itself. Her forehead touched my shoulder first, tentative and trembling. Instinctively, I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. She melted against me, her cheek resting against my chest, and in that simple contact, everything we had been holding back came rushing through. Her scent, familiar yet intoxicating, filled my senses. The warmth of her body pressed lightly against mine, the rhythm of her breath uneven but real. My heart pounded, not just with desire but with something deeper, the ache of wanting to protect her, to hold her, to make her feel seen in a way no one else had. She whispered into the fabric of my shirt, so faint I almost missed it. "I don't want this to end." I tightened my hold around her, resting my chin gently on her hair. "Then don't let it." In that moment, the world beyond the porch didn't exist. There was only her in my arms, and the quiet certainty that neither of us could pretend anymore. The next time I saw her, the air between us was different, heavier, as if the unspoken words from that rainy night had followed us, waiting to be answered. I found her in the backyard, just as the sun was setting. She was sitting on the wooden steps of the porch, her arms wrapped loosely around herself, staring at the horizon where the light melted into shades of gold and violet. I hesitated in the doorway, but something about her posture, the quiet curve of her shoulders, the loneliness she carried so gracefully, pulled me forward. When I sat down beside her, she didn't look at me right away. Her voice was quiet, almost carried away by the evening air. "You shouldn't be here so much," she said. "People will notice." Her words stung more than I expected. I turned toward her, searching her profile in the fading light. "Do you want me to stop coming?" Finally, her eyes flicked to mine, and for the first time, I saw the conflict laid bare, longing and restraint tangled together. She shook her head faintly. "That's the problem. I don't want you to stop." The honesty in her voice was fragile, trembling, but it cracked something open inside me. I reached for her hand slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When my fingers brushed hers, she let them stay, her hand warm but unsteady in mine. She closed her eyes, breathing in deeply, as if gathering courage. "This isn't fair to you," she whispered. "You deserve someone who doesn't come with all this complication." I squeezed her hand gently, anchoring her. "I don't care about complications. I care about you." Her breath caught, sharp and shaky, and then she finally turned fully toward me. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. No masks, no barriers, just the raw truth of what we both felt but had been afraid to admit. And then it happened. She leaned forward, slowly, as if testing the air itself. Her forehead touched my shoulder first, tentative and trembling. Instinctively, I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. She melted against me, her cheek resting against my chest, and in that simple contact, everything we had been holding back came rushing through. Her scent, familiar yet intoxicating, filled my senses. The warmth of her body pressed lightly against mine, the rhythm of her breath uneven but real. My heart pounded, not just with desire but with something deeper, the ache of wanting to protect her, to hold her, to make her feel seen in a way no one else had. She whispered into the fabric of my shirt, so faint I almost missed it. "I don't want this to end." I tightened my hold around her, resting my chin gently on her hair. "Then don't let it." In that moment, the world beyond the porch didn't exist. There was only her in my arms, and the quiet certainty that neither of us could pretend anymore.